Welcome back, explorers, to Whoosh Tales, the home of the greatest kids' adventure stories anywhere on the internet, bringing you a brand new English story for children every single week. This is episode 16, and if you have been with Finn Walker from the very first night the sky cracked open over Stonehaven Village, you already know that we have gone deep into oceans and mountains and space and forests and the very heart of the world itself. Today's story is going to be a different kind of deep. It is going to stay entirely at the cottage in Stonehaven, entirely on one quiet Highland afternoon, entirely across the space of one long, careful conversation around the same kitchen table where old Thomas told the truth about their grandfather 6 episodes ago. Because someone is about to knock at the front door, and what they will bring inside that door is going to change how Finn and Caleb understand their whole family history. Not by contradicting anything they've already learned, but by adding to it the second half of a story they did not know had a second half at all. 2 days had passed since the brothers had come home from the Arabian Sea and slept for 14 hours in their beds beneath the eaves of the small stone cottage. Old Thomas had listened carefully the morning after their return to the full account of the underwater chamber and the small revived creature, and the discovery that there were more of them out there, waiting quietly for old ones to find them before their calls got too faint to be heard. He had listened without interrupting, the way old Thomas always listened to important things. And at the end he had sat quietly for a long moment and then had said simply, "We will make a list. Anya will know some of the locations. There will be others in old records I know how to find. Caleb will be able to sense any that he passes within a certain range of. This will be the work of a lifetime, Caleb. It will not be finished in a summer or a year. It will be the slow, patient work of the rest of your life, and probably of any old one who comes after you." Caleb had nodded. He had understood already. He was preparing himself for that shape of life the way a person prepares themselves for any long, good work. Not with dread, but with a small, quiet gathering of readiness at the center of himself. By the second morning home, the boys had settled back into cottage rhythms with the quick, easy adaptability of children. Their mother was making bread in the kitchen when Finn came downstairs that afternoon. The warm, rich smell of the flour and the yeast and the slow rising of dough filling the whole downstairs of the cottage in the particular way that home baking fills a small house. Nora was reading in the front room, curled in her favorite armchair by the small stone hearth. Caleb was sitting on the back step in the warm Highland afternoon sunlight, watching a small song thrush picking about in the herb garden with the same slow, attentive appreciation he brought to everything. Everything, in short, was ordinary, which was one of the small, quiet miracles of the family the boys were beginning to build together. That even after everything, ordinary was still available, and everyone had learned to receive it gratefully whenever it arrived. The knock at the door came at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was not a loud knock. It was 3 small, careful taps of a knuckle against the ancient wood. The knock of a person who did not want to startle anybody, who understood that she was arriving somewhere she had never been before, and who was giving whoever was inside a moment to gather themselves before the door opened. Their mother wiped her floured hands on her apron and went to the door. Finn had come into the kitchen for a piece of the bread that was cooling on the wooden board and was in exactly the right position to see the woman who was standing on the front step when their mother opened the door. She was small, perhaps 5'2", and very neat, and probably about 60 years old. She had short, soft gray hair cut into a tidy shape around her ears. She was wearing a warm brown wool coat and a pale blue scarf and comfortable walking shoes. She had the kind lines around her eyes that people get when they have spent a lifetime being interested in things and paying close attention. She was carrying a small worn leather bag over one shoulder, the size of a large book, and she was standing on the front step with the calm, patient composure of a person who had been waiting a very long time to arrive at exactly this address and was simply grateful, now that she had, to be here at all. She looked at Finn's mother. Her face was very kind. Her voice, when she spoke, had a soft English accent from somewhere Finn could not immediately identify. She said, "Hello. I do apologize for arriving without any warning. My name is Margaret Halloran. I knew your father-in-law. I have been meaning to come here for 10 years, and I have finally worked up the courage to actually do it. May I come in?" Their mother stood very still for a moment in the open doorway. She had been prepared, at that moment, for many possible things. She had not been prepared for a small, neat, 60-year-old woman with a worn leather bag arriving at 4 in the afternoon on an ordinary Tuesday, having known her father-in-law and having taken 10 years to gather the courage to visit. She looked at Finn briefly over her shoulder, and Finn understood the look and moved back into the kitchen to give her privacy for whatever the next 30 seconds required. Then their mother looked back at the small, kind woman on the step and said, quietly, of course, "Please come in. Would you like a cup of tea?" "That would be very lovely," said Margaret Halloran gently. "Thank you very much." They gathered slowly in the kitchen. Nora had come out of the front room at the sound of the door and had understood immediately from her mother's face that something significant was arriving. She had put the kettle on without needing to be asked, which was one of the many small ways Nora contributed to important moments in the family. Caleb had come in from the back step a few moments later, alerted by the same signal that alerted him to most important things, which was some subtle change in the quality of the presence in the cottage. He had stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the small woman sitting now at the kitchen table, and Margaret Halloran had looked up at him, and her face had done something extremely interesting. Her eyes had gone momentarily wide, and one hand had lifted involuntarily to her chest, and she had said very softly, "Oh, oh," and then after a moment, "Oh, my dear boy." So it did happen. She had wiped a small tear from the corner of her eye and had smiled at Caleb warmly. "Please forgive me," she said. "It is a great deal to see you standing there. I have known about you since before you were born, but I have not been sure until this moment that you were real. Your grandfather was quite certain that you would be. But it is one thing to be told something and another thing to see the small person the story was about actually walk into a kitchen. It is very, very lovely to meet you, Caleb. Come and sit down, please." Caleb walked slowly into the kitchen and sat down at the table. His face was calm, but Finn could see that the amber gold of his brother's skin had come up gently at the shock of being known by someone he had never met, and Finn understood that Caleb was, in his own quiet way, considerably moved. Their mother placed a cup of tea in front of Margaret Halloran. Nora placed a small plate of buttered bread at the center of the table. Everyone sat down. Their mother sat at the head. Margaret Halloran sat opposite the boys, with Nora beside her and their mother closest to her right, and Finn and Caleb across from her side by side. Margaret Halloran took a small sip of her tea. She looked at Finn's mother with the particular careful attention of someone who understood that she was about to change the shape of a family's understanding of itself and wanted to do it as kindly as possible. Then she began. "I met your father-in-law 52 years ago," she said. "I was a young woman then, 21 I think, and I was working in the archives of a very small and very obscure library in the north of England. Your father-in-law came into that library one gray afternoon in autumn looking for a specific text that only 3 copies of exist in the world. It is called the Book of Faint Voices. It is a compilation of the traditions and half-forgotten knowledge of the old ones, the kind of people Caleb is. Your father-in-law had spent the previous 3 years working out from various clues that such a book must exist and had finally traced one of the 3 copies to my archive. I brought it to him. I sat with him while he read it. This was a rare book archive. The text could not leave the premises. And by the end of the afternoon, we were speaking together carefully and quietly the way 2 people speak when they discover in each other exactly the kind of thoughtfulness they had both been looking for their entire lives without knowing what they were looking for." She paused. She looked at Finn's mother with great gentleness. "He came back the next weekend, and the weekend after that. And for the next 15 years, he came to my archive one weekend every 3 months to read from the Book of Faint Voices and to work with me on the map we were building together. A map of every known place in the world where an old one's chamber, or a small warm creature like the ones your boys have now met, or a forest or a mountain or a passage of the kind you know about, was recorded to have existed. Your father-in-law came alone. He always came alone. He never told your husband about me, and he never told me very much about his family life. That was the deliberate agreement between us. Our work was quiet and long and had to be kept separate from the rest of the world to be effective, and neither of us ever considered breaking that boundary. I never met your husband. I never met you. And I certainly never met these 2 extraordinary young men." She looked at the boys. "But your father-in-law spoke about all of you a great deal," she added warmly. "Not by name at first. He was careful. But about a decade into our work, he began to allow himself the occasional reference, his son, his daughter-in-law, his small grandchildren who might one day, if certain things went the way he was quietly working to make them go, be the people who would eventually meet the creatures we were mapping. She took a slow breath. When he descended into the chamber beneath Greymore Mountain, she went on gently. He had spent the previous 8 weeks putting the entire archive in order. He came to me for the last time 3 days before he made his descent. He told me what he was going to do. I did not try to stop him. I did not want to stop him. He was not making the decision lightly, and it was not my place to argue with a man who had thought about a thing for 3 years and had reached a settled, peaceful conclusion about it. What I did do was to promise him 2 things. The first was that I would keep the archive intact and safe for the rest of my life. The second was that when the time came, when I judged that the boys had come to the natural end of the first part of their journey, which is the part your grandfather laid out for them, and were ready to begin the second part, which is the larger work of the map, I would come to this door and I would bring what I have brought. She placed the small worn leather bag on the table gently. She unbuckled it. She reached inside. She brought out a small wooden box. It was the size of a large book. It was made of the same warm, rich brown wood as the door of the room where Caleb had waited 11 years inside the mountain, and its lid was hinged and had a small brass clasp at the front. She placed it in the center of the kitchen table. She looked around at all of them. Then she opened the box. Inside, on the top layer, was a stack of letters bound together with a soft blue ribbon. Beneath the letters, folded very small, a piece of paper that Finn could see even without touching it was a map. Beneath the map, a small brass instrument that looked something like a compass but was more complex, with additional dials and small, carefully etched markings around its edge in a script Finn recognized as the same script that had covered the walls of the underground chamber beneath the cottage and the bark of the oldest tree in the graywood. And beneath the instrument, at the bottom of the box, a small dark leather journal about the thickness of a family Bible, its pages edged with age, but its spine still perfectly intact, held together as carefully as anything Finn had ever seen. Margaret Halloran looked at all of them again. This, she said quietly, is the archive. What is in this box represents 15 years of our shared work. The map records every known location, 37 places across the world where an old one's presence is required or has been required over the past several thousand years. 12 of those places have been visited by old ones within the last 200 years and are known to be currently well. 8 of them are on the map because their locations have been recorded by other old ones over the centuries, but the current state of what is inside them is unknown. And 17 of them, 17, are locations that your grandfather and I identified through cross-referencing texts and old accounts and traces and small stories, and which have never been visited within recorded memory. She looked at Caleb steadily. 17 chambers, in various parts of the world, containing small, warm creatures who have been alone in the dark for at least 3,000 years and possibly considerably longer. Some of them will still be alive. Some of them, if we do not reach them soon, will not be. The one you found in the Arabian Sea was one of the 17. The map shows where the other 16 are. She let this settle for a moment. Then she went on more gently. The compass in the box was built by your grandfather in the last 6 months of his life. He built it for Caleb. It is calibrated to respond to Caleb's specific light. Nobody else could operate it. It will not point in the way the other compasses have pointed. It works differently. It will suggest, from wherever Caleb is standing in the world, the nearest still unvisited chamber location that can most usefully be reached from that starting point. It is a working tool. It will guide the work of your lifetime. She paused. And the journal contains everything your grandfather and I learned about the traditions, the practices, the histories, the small things about how to sit with a chamber creature properly, the words that some old ones have used and some others have chosen not to use. Everything a young old one might need to know to become a good practitioner of what he was born to be. She looked at Caleb. It is your inheritance, my dear. Not the whole of it. Just the working parts. The kitchen was completely quiet. Their mother had covered her mouth gently with one hand and was crying silent, slow tears. Nora had reached over and put her hand on their mother's hand. Caleb was looking at the small brass instrument in the box with a face that contained more emotion simultaneously than Finn could easily count. Finn himself was sitting very still, feeling something enormous and warm and complicated settling into his chest. Their mother spoke first. After a long moment, "Thank you," she said, softly. "Thank you for keeping this safe. Thank you for coming." She paused. "And thank you for being the person he was working with for 15 years. I did not know he had a friend like you. I am so glad he did." She could not immediately continue. Margaret Halloran reached across the table and took their mother's hand. "He had a wonderful family," she said gently. "That is why he could do the work. Everyone who does this kind of work needs somewhere warm to come home to. You were that place. All of you." They sat together for a long time after that. Margaret Halloran told them small stories about their grandfather, the way he had taken his tea, the small dry jokes he had made when he was tired, the particular way he had of stopping mid-sentence to look at things, which had also been the way Caleb had of doing the same thing, which by now none of them found surprising. She told them about the way he had cried once, quietly in her archive, when he had first understood that the boy he was preparing to meet, the boy who was going to be Caleb, was actually going to be real and was going to have to live his whole life carrying this particular gift. She told them about the letter he had written to his future grandson Caleb and had left in her archive to be delivered when the time was right. She reached back into the small, worn leather bag and produced that letter now and placed it in front of Caleb. It was in the same familiar, slanted, urgent handwriting as everything else their grandfather had written. It was addressed simply to "My Caleb." Caleb picked it up with hands that were completely steady. He did not open it. Not yet. He tucked it very carefully into the inside pocket of his cardigan, close to his chest, and rested one hand briefly over it. "I will read it later," Caleb said quietly to Margaret. "Somewhere quieter. Somewhere I can be alone with him for a little while." "Of course, my dear," said Margaret. "That is exactly the right thing to do." Their mother made supper for all of them, and Margaret stayed to eat. She sat with them at the kitchen table in the deepening gold of the Highland evening as the smell of the bread from the afternoon mingled with the smell of the vegetable soup their mother had made and the small bowl of the last of Mrs. McTavish's tomato chutney that Nora produced almost ceremonially from the pantry. Margaret answered every question they asked her carefully and gently. She stayed for a second cup of tea after supper. She insisted, when eventually she got up to leave, that she was quite happy to walk down to the small guest house in the village where she had booked a room for the night, and that she would come back in the morning to help the family begin to work through the map and the journal. They walked her to the door together, all four of them, and their mother hugged her carefully at the front step, and Margaret Halloran hugged her back, and then she hugged Nora, and then she reached out and touched Caleb's cheek very gently, and then she took Finn's hand and pressed it between both of hers and looked at him and said simply, "You are exactly what he hoped for. Both of you are. I am so glad I lived long enough to meet you." Then she walked down the small path to the front gate and turned once and waved, and they all waved back, and she walked away into the deep gold Highland evening toward the small guest house in the village. They stood in the doorway for a long moment after she had gone. The stars were just beginning to appear above the eastern hills. The bell tower down in the village was faintly humming, as it now did at particular quiet times of day. In the kitchen behind them, the small wooden box still sat open on the table with all its contents visible in the warm lamplight. Their mother finally turned and looked at her three children in the doorway and smiled a smile that was very tired and very moved and very complete. "Well, boys," she said, "it seems we have work to do. Nora, I think we should look at the map together after dinner tomorrow and start understanding what we are looking at. Caleb, my darling, that letter is yours, and no one will ask you anything about it unless you choose to share it. Finn, my brave one, you have another compass now, don't you? Time to learn how it feels." She looked at all three of them, and Finn realized in that moment how much she loved them, how much she had been holding through the whole afternoon, how good she was at receiving huge things and letting them be huge without losing herself in them. And he understood with a small, deep, quiet realization that his mother, too, was one of the people who held the world together, in her own quiet way. That there had been, in every generation of the Walker family Finn knew about, at least one person doing the quiet good work. His grandfather explicitly, his mother in her steady, careful loving of the family that had been given to her, Nora in the way she prepared kitchens for important conversations, and now Caleb and Finn in whatever was going to come next. Later that night, after their mother had gone to bed and Nora had fallen asleep with her book on her lap in the armchair by the hearth, Caleb and Finn sat together on the back step of the cottage under the Highland stars. Ember was curled in the barn a few meters away, with one warm golden eye visible in the dark. Caleb took the letter out of his cardigan pocket. He held it for a long time in his hands without opening it. Finn watched him carefully and did not speak. Finally, Caleb looked at Finn and said, quietly, "Will you sit with me while I read it?" "Yes," Finn said. "Of course." He shifted closer on the step, so their shoulders were touching, and put his arm around his brother's shoulders. Caleb opened the envelope carefully. He unfolded the paper inside. His grandfather's slanted, urgent handwriting was the same as it always was, full of the kind of care and love that comes off certain people's writing the way the smell of good bread comes off a warm loaf. Caleb began to read it silently. Finn sat with him. He did not read over his brother's shoulder. He simply sat, present, warm there. After a few minutes, Caleb's shoulders began to shake very gently, and Finn tightened his arm around him, and Caleb leaned his head against Finn's shoulder and continued reading, tears falling quietly onto the paper without smudging any of the words. When he had finished, he folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest and closed his eyes and breathed out very slowly for a long moment. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Finn and said, very quietly, "He loved us." "Yes," Finn said gently. "He really did." "I know," Caleb said, "but knowing it and reading it in his own hand to me directly are different." "Yes," Finn said. "They are." Caleb tucked the letter back into his cardigan pocket, close to his chest. He leaned his head back against Finn's shoulder. The two brothers sat together on the back step under the Highland stars and did not say anything else for a long time. And above them a warm summer breeze moved gently through the rambling roses in full bloom over the low garden wall, and behind them in the kitchen the small wooden box on the table waited patiently for the morning, when its long, slow, careful work would begin. And that, the lesson at the heart of this kid's adventure story for explorers, is one of the deepest lessons this series has yet offered. Almost every person you have ever met and every person you will ever meet has had, at some point, a helper, a quiet companion, somebody who worked with them or supported them or believed in them without needing to be seen or mentioned or thanked. When you find out about those quiet helpers, when someone finally comes to your door with the second half of a story you did not know had a second half, receive them with everything you have. Do not try to reduce them to a small footnote in a story you already thought you knew. Let them expand the story, because the truth is that almost nothing important in this world is done alone. Behind every great life is at least one other person who was quietly there, holding a corner of it. Learn to see those people. Thank them when you can. Be one of them for someone else when it is your turn. That is how the world's real work happens. Not through solo heroes. Through partners. Through friends. Through the quiet, steady, patient companions who show up in libraries in the north of England on gray autumn afternoons and stay for 15 years. Hey, explorers! If you sat in the kitchen this afternoon with Finn, Caleb, Nora, and their mother as Margaret Halloran opened her small, worn leather bag on their table and revealed the second half of their grandfather's life's work, give this video the biggest thumbs up it has ever received, because you have absolutely earned every single quiet moment of it. Our comment question today is one of our warmest yet. Is there someone in your own extended family or your community whose story you would love to know more about? Someone you have always wondered about? Someone whose life might have a quiet second half you have not heard yet? Tell us about them in the comments below. Every single response will be read with great care. Subscribe to Whoosh Tales right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single adventure story for kids. Because next week, Finn and Caleb travel with Margaret Halloran to a place their grandfather visited every single year of his life for 15 years and never told anybody. What they find at the end of that journey will begin the second great chapter of the Whoosh Tales adventure. We will see you next week, explorers. Hush! In the deepest part of that night, after Caleb had eventually gone up to bed and Finn had helped their mother move the small wooden box from the kitchen table to the top of the bureau in the front room for safekeeping, Finn stood for a moment in the front room, looking down at the open box in the soft light of a single lamp. The stack of letters bound in blue ribbon. The folded map. The small brass instrument built for Caleb's light. The dark leather journal. 15 years of quiet, careful shared work between an old man and a young woman in an obscure archive in the north of England, sitting in front of Finn now in a small wooden box in his family's front room. He thought about Margaret walking down the small dark path to her guest house in the village that evening, with her worn leather bag empty for the first time in 10 years, and he thought about how much lighter she must have been walking than she had been walking on the way here that afternoon. He thought about the quiet good work of holding a promise across a decade, about the way certain people become the keepers of other people's most important things and hold them faithfully until the right moment. He closed the small wooden box gently, careful not to disturb the ribbon around the letters. He turned off the lamp. He went upstairs. He climbed into bed. Caleb was already deeply asleep on his blankets beside the bed. In Caleb's cardigan pocket, folded carefully, was the letter their grandfather had written him. In the front room downstairs, in the small wooden box on top of the bureau, waited the next 50 years of Caleb's life's work. And Finn, closing his eyes in the warm, familiar dark of his bedroom, felt, more clearly than he had ever felt it before, the enormous quiet privilege of being alive in the middle of this particular family at this particular moment in its long, good history. He fell asleep quickly and slept extremely well.